William, your videographer from Two Hats Publishing. Welcome to the College of Complexes, being held at Barbeck's Restaurant at 8949 Garland Road, Dallas, Texas. Gently embracing the east side of White Rock Lake. When I entered, I was greeted like coming home to Grandma's house, warm and friendly. When visiting the Barbeck's Restaurant, tell them you want your reservations for the next College of Complex class.
Well, welcome to the College of Complexes. This is our 213th meeting. We actually started in February of 2009. We've been meeting ever since. We put a speaker on every week, a different subject. We require a speaker to take a position on an issue, express a point of view. They have to be for or against something. We don't care what it is. We give an hour to make a presentation. If anyone interrupts our speaker, we remind the interrupter that we only listen to one fool at a time. That's our rule, one fool at a time. And if we have he's clapping anyway. I lost train of thought here. One fool at a time. Anyway, then we have questions and answers, not speeches. And then we have remarks, rebuttals. Everyone in the audience here gets 5 minutes at the podium that wants to respond to what the speaker said, for or against. And then our speaker gets the last word. He gets a comment and close the meeting. That's how it works. But before we introduce our speaker, are there any announcements? Now's the time for announcements. If anybody has them. Someone usually has announcements. Susie, got any announcements tonight? She usually has them. No announcement. Oh, she's getting up. Here she comes. She's going to give us an announcement. She had to think about it.
Good heavens. I want to remind everybody the primaries are coming up. I don't care how you vote, Democrat, Republican, Libertarian, Green Party. I care that you vote. Okay? So seek out the party of your preference and vote in their primary. It's important. If you are unsure how to find out information about voting, I would ask you to just go to a website called turbovote.org and plug in your information. It's a nonpartisan site. It will send you a reminder that an election is coming up, and it will give you links to different ballots and things, all right? Now, I am supporting Wendy Davis for Texas governor, as well as Letitia Van de Putte, as well as a host of other characters that at some point I am hoping will come and speak here to sort of rebut what we had a couple of weeks ago with someone who claimed to be a Democrat who definitely was not. But the other thing that I'd like and encourage you to do is this is the time where there are a lot of candidate forums going on where you can go to one of these places and you can see the candidates who are running against each other in the primaries, and they're questioned. They'll take, some of them are town hall forums, some of them are questions and answers from the audience. You can kind of give candidates the sniff test as to whether you'd want this person representing your interests or not. And one such candidate forum will be held on February the 15th by what we call lovingly the Big East, which is a collection of several Democratic clubs that got together. Will be at Dunford Rec Center, which is in Mesquite. That's on Green Canyon Road for those of you who aren't familiar with Mesquite. Dunford Rec Center is on Green Canyon Road. This will be Saturday, February the 15th, and I believe it's from 9 until 4. We'll have many candidates there, and so we want to give everybody an opportunity to see how they perform under pressure and ask them your questions and show up, and let's check it out. Now, if you're from some other political party, you're going to have to go find your own, because I'm not here to tell you about that. Thanks.
Any other announcements? Yes. Come on up here. Oh, you have an announcement. All right.
Okay, next Friday, January 31st, is a National Day of Action Against the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And this is the worst of the free trade agreements that come out down the pike. Not only will it send more jobs overseas, but it'll also undermine all sovereignty so that any federal, state, or local law that is enacted can be overturned by these corporate tribunals because they think it interferes with their profits, and they can even sue us for billions of dollars of lost future profits. And it's going to undermine food safety. It's going to dump all this food from China that's extremely substandard into our food supply, and so we're all going to be running like rivers, and it's going to be a very bad situation. It's at Clyde Warren Park at noon. I know some people are retired and other people are working, but maybe if you're working, you can get out there on your lunch hour. So it's at Clyde Warren Park on Olive Street downtown over the Woodall Rogers overpass there, and it's this Friday, January 31st, straight up at noon to 1, so it's during people's lunch hour. Thank you.
This kind of segues into that last one pretty well. I saw on the internet, something that caused somebody a lot of alarm. I don't know exactly what it means. Maybe somebody else here knows more about it. But the Dallas City Council passed an ordinance that is kind of raised the suspicion of some people that you cannot distract anybody within 75 feet of a road. You're not allowed to protest, you're not allowed to carry a sign, you're not allowed to wear a funny costume, and you can't have a very beautiful face or an ugly face, whatever distracts the driver is the way it's written. It's written vaguely. Reminds me a little bit like the NDAA, you know, it's like vague terms, whatever we need. So, you know, you mentioned the protest coming up, and so I think it's interesting news. And the other announcement I want to make is I swear allegiance to Obama, no matter what he does, because he's black, even if he's not, and whatever he does, I pledge allegiance till I die.
Any other announcements? Now's your chance. Okay, well, I guess not. Next week we have, she's sitting over here, Joan Cavici. She's the one that put me onto these people. Call for reform, let's fix our prisons and our criminal justice system. That's next week. With Michael Jowell and Josh Gibbons, President and Chairman of the Board, respectively, of Texas Cure Citizens United for Rehabilitation of Errants, to discuss how our criminal justice system is broken and dire need of reform. I won't read all this. You have it in front of you, and you can look at that. 2 weeks from now, we have giving to Caesar what belongs to God. If it was created free, why give up my right to choose? Reverend Raphael Bishop is going to be here, so that ought to be good. Bishop Raphael, I got that backwards. Anyway, that's he's our speaker 2 weeks from now. That's on the sheet most of you have. But now for tonight, the title of tonight's speech is There Is No Conspiracy. It's by John Beesley. He's an English-born author, retired from a long career with Xerox, educated at London's Imperial College, University of Dallas, MBA, DIC, PhD. He'll discuss how currently, there's his book. He wrote a book too, just so you know, Sabotaging America. He'll discuss how currently there are many conspiracy notions floating about, yet most critical non-conspiracy is one that has most affected the lives and futures of the general American public, which he referred to on the back cover of his book, which was just holding up in the air here, Sabotaging America, stating The financial crisis that erupted in September 2008 is a symptom of far larger problems facing America. The ideology has guided policy decisions for the past 60 years, rests on concepts that bear no relation to the actual economic condition in which the U.S. now finds itself. Such arrangements suit the elite that fund the political class in Washington. In effect, the ruling elite has sabotaged the future of America for its own enrichment. John will show how this American self-inflicted tragedy started with FDR, has continued with every president since, and how the failed international macroeconomic policies pursued by these administrations cannot be regarded as a conspiracy, since each faltering step was widely publicized. He will cover political decisions, their general repercussions, and where we need to go from here. So without further ado, please give a very, very warm welcome to John Beesley.
Well, thank you. Thank you for coming, and my wife is even more grateful. So she gets me out of the house and doesn't hear my ranting and ravings anymore. And thanks for Tom and Jim for arranging this gathering, because it does take a great deal of work. So tonight I'm going to talk about the talk title, There Is No Conspiracy. This came about because last year we had a few talks involving conspiracy, like the JFK conspiracy and other things like that. And I was looking on the internet, and lo and behold, there was a suggested video. And up came guys associated with Project Avalon and Project Camelot. There was an English guy in a sort of a felt hat and an American lady, and they interviewed all these conspiracy people. And so I learned a lot about, you know, the Rothschilds taking over everything, about a lady who claimed to be a Rothschild. She came in from another dimension, another universe, and she was going to help us out, and so on and so forth. But so having been initiated with all those conspiracies, I said, well, you know, look, let me step back. What is really going on in America? And I decided, look, what is really going on is what is really important. And it isn't a conspiracy, because all these faltering steps, all these political decisions are well known. So let's go through it tonight. And most of you will have known these things. But before I begin, I must give you some definitions. The first definition, I'll be talking about the GDP. That means the gross national product. So that's the output of every working American in business, in factories, and so on. Even bankers are part of it. The next definition has to do with real as opposed to nominal. So I think you'll understand this when we talk about wages. For example, when you go home with a 5% increase in wages, thank you, sir, you'll say, my goodness, I feel a lot wealthier because I've got a 5% increase. Now, if during a period the cost of living has gone up by 5%, that means your real wages have increased by 0%. So your nominal wages went up by 5%, but your real wages went up by 0%. On the other hand, if you've got an increase of 7%, your real wages would have gone up by 2%. On the other hand, yet again, if your wages had gone up by 3%, in fact, your wages would have gone down by 2%. So when I talk about things, I'll talk about real GDP, real wages, and real economy. So that's the way to look at things in the proper manner. Okay, so let's get started. Let's go back to the 2008 crash. Now, this was seen as a collapse of the financial system, and so the thought was, well, we just have to cure the financial system and get rid of those devils in Wall Street, and everything will be well. Well, unfortunately, that won't solve things, because, as I said in the wonderful introduction, there are far deeper problems than that. Now, my claim is that what's happened in 2008 is the inevitable outcome of political decisions that go as far back as World War II. And so what were they? Well, and of course, none of these were conspiratorial because they were well known as they happened. So during World War II, from the period of about 1943 to 45, the Allies got together and they started to plan the economic framework for after the war. And basically, that meant getting together, 128 countries, in fact, got together in Bretton Woods in 1944. That was in New Hampshire. But basically speaking, there were only really two countries involved, the United Kingdom and the USA. On the UK's side was Lord Keynes, and on the American side was Harry Dexter White. So they had radically different ideas about what to do. Keynes wanted to set up a system that would automatically balance trade, so you couldn't have a trade deficit. So, but on the other hand, which meant floating exchange rates or managed exchange rates. On the other hand, Harry Dexter White, who was assistant to Morgenthau, the Secretary of the Treasury, wanted to have a fixed exchange rate based on the dollar, plus other conditions. So that was one very fateful decision that was taken during the war, which I'll talk about in a minute. Now, the other thing that happened during the war took place in Saudi Arabia. Now, Standard Oil was given a lease to drill for oil in Saudi Arabia in the 1930s, mid-1930s. In 1938, they found oil. So during the war, this was deemed to be so important to the Americans that Roosevelt signed a Lend-Lease agreement with Saudi Arabia in 1944. In 1945, Roosevelt actually met with King Saud of Saudi Arabia to cement this arrangement. Now that set a precedent of using military power. Basically, the plan that they developed with Saudi Arabia was, provided they looked after Standard Oil, which of course is now Exxon, then America would protect them with military might. So that, as I say, set the precedent of protecting overseas cartels and American corporations with the military backup, and later on by the CIA. So that's where it started during wartime. So there were three consequences of this. Number one, of course, was the fact that it enabled this agreement with Bretton Woods, enabled America to run up a trade deficit, huge trade deficit subsequently. Secondly, it set up this precedent of protecting corporations using military force. And thirdly, it set up the situation of supporting extreme Islam, because Saudi Arabia, their sect of Islam is Wahhabism, and they've set up madrasas across the Arab world into Pakistan, and most of the Taliban get their ideas and teaching from these madrasas. So you see, it set up some very bad precedents during this regime. And of course, it was during the FDR's administration. So I will talk about some of the actions of the CIA, because they have had consequences. And I won't go through everything they've done, but I'll go through some of the things they've done. So starting in, there are three phases I'll talk about. First phase will be 45 to about 75, from 75 to 2001, and then 2001 until now. So there are really three phases, and gradually worse and worse things have happened. And basically, this non-conspiracy theory that I'm really talking about is not the war on communism or the war on terror. It's basically revolved into what I would term the war on the American people itself. So, starting in 46, you had the 45-year against communism, the Cold War. And basically, what you had was dreadful communism on one side, up against democracy and capitalism on the other side. And America spent millions, billions and billions of dollars engaged in this war. So stepping back, how did America do? Did America really win the Cold War? Well, my judgment is they lost. They lost. So why would I say that? Well, America now thinks of itself as a superpower, but it's broke. It's broke to the tune of a negative cumulative trade deficit of 10 trillion and a negative overseas wealth, that's to say how much America owns overseas compared with the wealth that foreign countries own here of minus 4 trillion. So basically speaking, American capitalism has got itself into a hell of a mess. They've lost. Now, the other part of the Cold War was to support democracy and capitalism. Well, as Tom says every week, we have the best democracy money can buy. So I wouldn't say we have a great deal of democracy. We appear to have the rich really funding the guys in Washington, and so the rich are getting what they want, and the ordinary people of America basically are ignored. So I wouldn't call that democracy. I would call that kleptocracy or something like that. What about capitalism? Well, as I surprised Ray by saying that we should return to it, because we really don't have capitalism. Adam Smith, who wrote The Wealth of Nations, would not recognize this economic system as a capitalist system. We in fact have a pre-capitalist system, mercantilism. If you look around on the high street, you'll see that we don't have a massive competition. For example, if you walk down the high street and you look where the banks are, we've got Chase Bank, and Bank of America. I mean, when I came to Dallas, it was Republic Bank and Preston State Bank, and they've gone in small banks. We just have these major. So what we have in the banking system are cartels, and mostly, if you look around at all the major industries, we have oligopolies. And overseas, we have cartels. Now, that is not the capitalism that Adam Smith wrote about. He wrote about free markets, competition, and free trade. He didn't write about cartels. So he would have recognized this system as a pre-capitalist system based on really favors from foreign governments like King Saud signing up with Exxon and so on. So that's my judgment there. And that is really where we've gone terribly wrong. We've allowed ourselves to move away from the free trade, free markets, and so on. So let's get back to what happened after the war. We had Truman came into power, and he let's see, where am I? Yes, he during the war, there was the Signals Intelligence Agency, and he changed that to become the NSA in 1951. He also set up the CIA in 1947. So that's where these agencies are now giving us trouble started. Now, the next, when Eisenhower was the next president, and he got together with the CIA and the British MI5 got together to overthrow Mossadegh in Iran, 1953. Apparently, the Anglo-Iranian oil company was due to be nationalized by Mossadegh. Now, Mossadegh was a democratically elected leader, of course. So They didn't like that, so they got together, threw him out. And they installed the Shah. In 79, of course, the Shah was removed, and we've had radical Islamists ever since giving us pains. Also, the activities of the CIA during this last period have been written about by a Texan called John Stockwell, wrote a book called Praetorian Guard and published in 1999. He claimed that the CIA conducted 3,000 illegal major operations and 10,000 illegal minor operations. And their aim was to stabilize, disrupt, and modify the actions of other countries. So, which really, I think, have rebounded back on America, but I'll get to that later. Well, Eisenhower was still in office. In 1954, the CIA assassinated President Arbenz in Guatemala because he had the effrontery to request that United Fruit make some of the land which was there free, which was not being used for the peasant people. So he was not, so his game was up. 1954, prior to 1954, the French were protectors of Vietnam, and they lost to the communists in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. But that's when America stepped in under Eisenhower and gave military aid to the South Vietnamese. Eisenhower was the inventor of the domino theory, whereby, one nation goes and the whole lot goes. So Eisenhower sent aid to the South Vietnamese, but also introduced advisors, about 900 advisors. In terms of economics during that period, because after the war America was doing well, but because of these ongoing military operations and bases around the world, in fact there was a dollar deficit accumulating overseas. And of course the City of London got to manage it, of course, and they were called euro dollars. And so that began to put pressure on the dollar, which was then set at $35 an ounce. So when JFK came in 1951, this dollar drain got to be a crisis. So he went to London, which is where gold is traded every day, even now, and got together with the central banks in Europe, and they arranged what was called the gold pool, which is where the central banks bought gold to prop the price up. Now, also, JFK looked at the situation in Vietnam after his success at the Bay of Pigs, you remember, and decided to increase the number of advisors in South Vietnam from the 900 that Eisenhower had left to 16,000. This clearly were not advisors. In fact, they took part in combat, and they were deaths. There were deaths and so on. But this was hidden from the American public. Now, there is a school of thought which says that, well, he would have not increased this numbers. He wouldn't have got involved further, and that he hid this because the 1964 elections were coming up, and he didn't want to appear to be weak on communism. Now other people say that he would have stayed in or not, as the case might be. Didn't matter. He was assassinated in '63, and LBJ came in. LBJ, of course, accelerated the war. In fact, he was up against Goldwater in the election, and of course the Goldwater slogan was, "In your heart, you know he's right." And Lyndon Johnson retorted, "In your guts, you know he's nuts." Now, who was right or what, we don't really know. But, such is politics. So LBJ went on the pretext of the Gulf of Tonkin, escalated the war in Vietnam, and so the outflow of dollars increased. LBJ also had introduced the civil so public support legislations of the late 70s, and so what you had was guns and butter without the taxes to support it. So you had huge budget deficits, or growing budget deficits, in the late 60s. And this also put a further strain, because of the war in Vietnam, on the dollar. So then the US contacted the IMF and borrowed money from the IMF in what was called special drawing rights. So essentially the IMF were propping up the dollar, basically so-called paper gold at the time. Then 68, Lyndon didn't accept the nomination, and Nixon came in and promised to de-escalate the war. Well, of course, he escalated the war in Laos and Cambodia, and this further put pressure on the dollar, and so that was why America crashed off the dollar in 71. In 73, with Kissinger, Allende was too left-wing for them to stomach, so he was got rid of and removed in Chile. Now, let's look at the general economic policies that the US were pursuing after the war. Basically speaking, you had full employment, policy of full employment, and a policy of tying the growth in wages to the increase in productivity. Now this, in economic parlance, is the virtuous policy, virtuous circle that Adam Smith talked about. So what you have is you have the GDP of America, whereby they have full employment, you have high wages. So with full employment, you have high savings. With the high savings, you have high investment, which goes into the industry, and then that translates into higher wages and so on. So you have this virtuous circle of economic policy. And if you look at the charts, you see that the real wages of Americans from 45, 46 until the mid-70s kept up almost exactly with the growth in the real. So the real wages kept up almost exactly with the real growth in GDP. So it was a fairly prosperous time. And it turns out that the peak in real wages in this country occurred in 1973. And from that point on, it's been below that in real wages, real buying power wages. Now, so that was basically the situation in this first phase. In the second phase is where things start to really go wrong. Ford, of course, was president, and as usual, the CIA was at it in Angola, for example. 75, they funded UNITA, which is one of the parties, 3 parties, and that resulted in a 17-year war. Then we had Carter to Reagan, and in 1979, the Sandinistas came into power in Nicaragua, which displeased Carter, so he began to fund the opposition. Also, in Afghanistan, a political party favored by the Russians came into power. So Carter began to fund the opposition in Afghanistan, and that started the Afghan war. The Russians lasted 10 years, and of course on our side then with the Mujahideen, which have now become the Taliban. So our once friends became our, we know they've got all these weapons because we gave them all these weapons. In 1980, in El Salvador, there were 4 nuns went there, and then they came back, and they knew it was very dangerous. So on the way from the airport, they were killed by the death squad. And Archbishop Romero had contacted Carter and said, would you stop funding these death squads? So later on, Romero was killed by the death squads. So then, of course, in 1980, the Iran-Iraq war started. And at that point, Hussein was our champion. And we knew he had weapons of mass destruction because we sold them to him, right? So now then he blotted his copybook, as they say, by invading Kuwait, because he thought he had the nod, and it had to be removed. Now you remember the Iran-Contra scandal, where the CIA was busily selling weapons to the other side in the Iran-Iraq war. We were already helping Iraq, Saddam Hussein, but the wheeze of the CIA was to sell weapons to the other side, to Iran, and then with that money, send weapons to the death squads in Nicaragua. Now, that was in violation of the Boland Amendment that forbade that. So Ollie North, remember him, you know, appeared before Congress. Reagan was sort of suspected, but he claimed he didn't know anything about it, and he probably didn't. I mean, he was semi-gaga at the time, so he probably didn't know anything. So let's go back. So that was sort of this period, early period. Let's go back over the economic policies that were going on. As I already explained, there were tremendous overseas debts piling up through these unfunded wars and so on. But also in 73 was the start of the oil shocks. And gasoline, I think, in 72 or 3 was like 44 cents a gallon. I think it was. Well, you know what it is today. So what the oil shocks and the overspending on Vietnam caused inflation to accelerate. And so in the late 70s, inflation had got to 11%. And it went as high as 13% in the early 80s. So the Federal Reserve has always stepped in under Volcker, and he raised interest rates from 11% in 79, 20% in 81, up to a high of 21.5% in 82. So obviously these policies caused a recession. Now there were 2 victims of this policy. The first was Carter, because he was blamed for causing inflation, which in fact wasn't his responsibility. I mean, he inherited them. And the second victim were the trade unions, because they were blamed for huge wage increases that caused the inflation. Well, what they were trying to do was keep up with inflation, let alone causing it. I already told you what the real causes were. So at that point is where I think the economic war against the Americans really took hold. That's when the war on the working people and the trade unions and so on really started. And so there was a policy at home and there was an international policy. So what happened was this virtuous circle of economic growth that I've just described was broken. Firstly, the commitment to full employment was broken. Secondly, the commitment of tying wages to productivity growth was broken. So in fact, from that point on, real wages had fallen from the peak in 73 to to the end of the 70s. But from the 80s onwards, basically real wages flatlined. So while real GDP grew, real wages flatlined. Now, what happened with that situation? Well, when you have real wages flatlining, but the real cost of living keep growing, what the households of America did was to increase their borrowing. So, in fact, from 1980 to 2000, 20 years, their borrowing went up by 50%. Now, strangely, or not strangely, the borrowing of the federal government actually didn't increase at all over that period. In fact, what happened was there was an increase, and this is the percentage of federal spending versus the GDP. Okay, percentage. It's about 20% usually. And when Reagan was in, and the initial years of Clinton, it actually went up. But then, of course, Clinton solved some of the project overspending, and it came down again. So over the whole period, really, the federal spending did not increase. But the other thing that happened, and the most important thing that happened, was in the financial world. So over that period, their borrowing went up by 100%, from about 20% of the GDP to 40% of the GDP, because they were deregulated and they invented new types of assets they could borrow against. And when you, as I say, when you have new assets, you can do more new borrowing. So you had, starting in that period, asset bubbles. And that's the thing it was focused on, asset bubbles. So that was really the start of the asset bubbles. And you must ask me as a question, and also the financial institutions not only had borrowed against asset bubbles, but developed a thing called leverage. Now ask me a question about John Corzine and leverage, and that will explain what goes on. So what you really had going on was a move away from an industrialized economy to a financialized economy. So also you had productive investment moving overseas. So you had jobs lost. Now the job loss can be seen that after the war there were 5 cycles, and the job loss can be seen most clearly by looking at manufacturing employment. So so after each one of these cycles, when you recovered, the manufacturing employment got larger and larger. So there was continuous growth in manufacturing employment after the war. In 1946, there were about 14 million people employed in manufacturing, and a peak in the 1970s, it was about 20 million. So what we had since then, since the crash, actually starting in the 80s, you had a decline, an ever-increasing decline in manufacturing employment. So whereas we had about 20 million people in 1977, by 2007, at the peak of we had 14 million. And now we have less than 12 million. So we have 2.5 million people in manufacturing, fewer people in manufacturing now than we had in 1946, even though the population has doubled. And the huge loss in employment has really been 5 million manufacturing jobs lost since 2000. So, but the flatlining in wages was ameliorated somewhat because of cheap imports. So this, but this financial crash that happened in 2008 was a crash that was waiting to happen. I mean, you could see it coming, because what happened is, really, it's because of these credit bubbles. Because what happened was, as I said, real wages were flatlining, so the households made up their income by borrowing. Well, at a certain point, the credit card runs out. Can't borrow anymore. Now, coupled with that, you had the financial world, which had by then evolved these shadow banks, engaged in massive leverage, 40 to 1. That's to say, their assets were, say, $1 billion, but they leveraged up to 40 to 50 billion. And it only takes a minor shock, and the whole house of cards just crashes. And so this sort of phony assets goes like a puff of wind, it just blows away. And in that crash, something like 20 trillion just blew away, and it wasn't real, in fact. The only real thing in an economy is the productive power of the American people, and that's what's been damaged. So this was bad enough, but this was exacerbated by three things that happened during that period. Number one, NAFTA was signed in 1984, and immediately you had a trade deficit with Mexico. And of course that was a threat to the unions because that had put a pressure on their wages. Second thing that happened in 97 was the East Asia crisis, where the IMF and the banks drove down the currencies of countries like Thailand, South Korea, and so on. Well, what that policy was all about was creating the strong dollar, because it suited American manufacturers who were manufacturing overseas to have a cheap dollar so they could import the goods more cheaply. Okay? It hurt American exporters because the strong dollar meant you couldn't export as much, but it suited the American corporations overseas. So what the American corporations basically had done was, instead of going overseas to create an export market, they went overseas to create a production zone for their goods. That's what happened. The third thing that happened was the China PNTR, which stands for Permanent Normal Trading Relations, in 2000. So what does that mean? Well, it means it's permanent and it's normal. So what does normal mean? It means to say that you have agreed with the Chinese that you will have the rule of law, it will protect property rights, patent rights, it will also let your bank and financial institutions operate somewhat. So that really opened up the door to this huge imports from China, and of course any of us that were looking saw this huge surge of imports from China, trebling it. Okay, so that accounts for this huge $10 trillion trade deficit we've now accumulated. Now, all these three things happened under Clinton, pushed by the famous duo of Larry Summers and Bob Rubin, who was Secretary of the Treasury. Okay, so what's happened? So that was, so really we've got to the current period. And so we've had the Bush-Obama wars and the Arab Spring, mostly about oil. And so if you remember a chap called Paul Wolfowitz, who said that, oh, don't worry folks, this won't cost us a thing. The Arabs will be so delighted to see us, the Iraqis, that they'll just pay for us in the oil. Well, some smart spark in the Treasury said he estimated it would cost $200 billion. So he was removed through. So $2 trillion later, here we are. So on the face of it, and of course the Chinese have bought about 2.5 trillion of treasuries. So on the face of it, it looks as if the Chinese have been paying for America's recent wars. That's quite a turn up for the books, don't you think? So of course, going back to the economic affairs, in 2000, the dot-com bubble burst, and that was an asset bubble. And so the Treasury, or Fed rather, decreased interest rates to 1%. And that set the stage for the housing bubble, which blew up in 2008. So, in fact, in terms of the economy peaked in November '07, and the real GDP was about 15 trillion. Now, the greatest calumny that's been perpetrated lately is, of course, by the Tea Party chaps. The claim is government spending has gone overboard. It's completely terrible. So we must get rid of the government and their spending with it. Well, in fact, at the peak in '07, federal spending, as I say, is generally around, since 1980s, about 20%. It was 19.6%, the federal government spending in '07. Obama came in and, of course, had some stimulus packages. At that point, the percentage of federal spending with respect to the GDP went up to about 22%. Now, in July of that year, the economy started to recover. And so by about January to 11, the economy had recovered back to 15 trillion, the real GDP. And now so we've had growth, and it's about almost 16 trillion now. So we've had a pretty decent recovery. But where is federal spending? Well, in fact, since the middle of 2009, in fact, it's gone down. It's gone down from 22%. It's now back down to about 19.6%. The real spending, the real federal spending versus the real GDP. And really that's what counts. Of course, the corporations, if you look at their profits, they've made huge profits over this period, over these last 5 years. Now, so what has the Federal Reserve been doing? Well, as you know, it's been pumping money into the economy, well, into the banks through quantitative easing. So what is this? Well, it's another huge bubble again. So where is this 2.5 trillion gone? Well, you've seen it. You've seen commodity bubbles, and about 90% of trading on the commodity stock exchange. So you've seen gas prices go up, food prices go up, metal prices go up, and so on. You've seen the stock market recover and go up beyond where it was. You've seen, if you looked at anything about the Forex, foreign currency trading, you now have about $6 trillion traded every day on the foreign currency market. So since the world GDP is about 60, so in 12 days, you've traded the whole output of the world in 12 days. And this LIBOR scandal that operated from London, where they were fixing the exchange rates, that's what they were doing. Because a small change in exchange rate will derive tens of millions in profits. So basically, this asset bubble that started over this period is still with us. And the banks are still doing everything that they did before with no redress at all. And this sort of bubble cannot go on. Obviously, we will have another big crash because nothing has been done to stop such things. So really, what's been going on, you've seen the hollowing out of America productivity, you've seen these recurring asset bubbles, and that's the fundamental problem that should be addressed, but it hasn't been. Now, so what's to do? Well, my first talk I gave here was like a couple of years ago, and my solutions are pretty much the same. I don't tend to change my mind. Firstly, we should have listened to Keynes, and so we would have had a balanced trading position. You couldn't have run up these huge trade deficits. We badly need financial reform. We need banks. Firstly, we need to split up the banks. I mean, you can't have, we have like 4 or 5 major banks, and they're much too large, they have too much power. They should be split up. And of course, Glass-Steagall should be reenacted and extended. So we should have banks that actually fund the productive part of the American economy. That's what they should be doing. Funding productive businesses of all sorts. The Obama stimulus created about 6 million jobs, but we're still about 12 million short about where we should be. So I've proposed several things where we'd actually create businesses and create jobs, because that's what we need to do. And of course, as you know, we've done a terrible, terrible disservice to our young people. Terrible. So that's what I would do. As a sort of a thought, I think the churches should get together. Instead of having a war against women and gays, perhaps they should do some good for once. And follow what the Catholic Church did with the Mondragon Corporation in Spain, whereby they actually set up businesses, formed a bank, and Mondragon is now the world's largest employee-owned company, over 100 million people. They are a manufacturing company. They make appliances. They make manufacturing equipment. They do software development. Okay? And it's all employee-owned and employee managed. Now, if the churches in this country would get together and do something positive, I would applaud them. I might even join one. Thank you.
Stay there, John. John gets to stay here now. We had questions of John. Here we are. It's time for questions. Oh, yes. I got to take care of the check. Who wants the first question? Someone has to be first.
We'll give it over here.
All right.
Damn it. John, what do you think would happen if they didn't have TARP at the time? What would happen to the world economy?
Well, TARP was what, the Troubled Bankers Relief Package, right? What would have happened? Well, what should have happened is banks should have been recognized as a business. And when you fail in business, you go out of business. That's what should have happened. We should have reenacted right away Glass-Steagall. We should have broken up the banks. We should have taken them over. And after a while, we could have, so we would have privatized them. And then gradually, we would have restored them and then set them back free again. Okay, that's what should have happened. The stimulus, Christina Roma was part of the Obama's Economic Council. She was dying to say in the council, it's the demand, it's the demand. But of course Summers was in control, and so the stimulus package is only half of what it should have been to get us back. But as I say, this fundamental problem of asset bubbles has not been solved. So ask me about John Corzine.
What about John?
What about John Corzine? Okay. This is a digression, but it gives you it will open a window into the financial world. So in my work of fiction, non-fiction, I talk about the Cozy Money Club. Now, Timothy Geithner exemplifies the Cozy Money Club. He, young chap, he worked for the Kissinger Associates. Then he went to the Treasury, and he was understudy to Rubin and Summers. Then, based on that accolade, he became head of the Federal Reserve in New York, overseeing the banks. Well, after his success, when all the banks crashed in New York, he became Treasury Secretary under Obama. And now he left that, and now he's the head of a hedge fund. So we have this cozy circle of Wall Street, Federal Reserve, Treasury, round and round they go. And they all look after one another. So now we get to 1998, an outfit called Long-Term Capital Management. It was a hedge fund partnership for high net worth individuals, headquartered, of course, in the Cayman Islands. It was set up by some very illustrious people, like Robert Merton from MIT, professor at MIT, Myron Scholes, professor at Stanford, and David Mullins, who was vice president of the Federal Reserve. Well, they got into the bond arbitrage game using Russian bonds. Well, it went against them, so the whole lot was lost. However, they were a member of the Cozy Money Club. So in stepped the Fed, and they were bailed out to the tune of $4 trillion. Now, I'd like to enter the stock market and be saved with my misdeeds. Now, interestingly enough, John Corzine was head of Goldman Sachs at the time, okay, and he aided this bailout. Well, poor old John Corzine had a run-in with Henry Paulson, who was later the Secretary of Treasury, and so he was ousted from Goldman Sachs. So Corzine became, after that, Democratic senator for New Jersey until 2005, governor of New Jersey after that from 2006 to 2010, and then he left that, and then he became head of MF Global. Now, Corzine was a banker, obviously. So what did MF Global do? Well, they got mixed up in a thing called reverse repo. Reverse repo. So let me explain how reverse repo and leverage works. Okay, so the government of Spain, remember, the federal, the government and the Federal Reserve Bank of Spain was in trouble, okay, because of the European problems we've seen. But they held, so the Federal Reserve Bank of Spain held a lot of Spanish bonds, okay? Now, so MF Global stepped in and said, well, we'll help you out, we'll buy your Italian bonds at a discount, right? So with their funds from their investors, they bought a pile of bonds. Now, with this asset, they went back and they could borrow against the bonds. So with that new pile of money, they went back again and bought some more bonds. Right? Now with that asset, they went back again and borrowed some more debt. Now you keep doing this until you've got a whole stack of bonds, but this is why your leverage, say you start off with 1 trillion, you now parlayed this super repo business up and up and up until you leveraged it up to 40 to 50 billion in bonds. Well, that's fine, but what happened was that then Italy came under some stress. So their interest rates went from, say, 6% up to like 8%. Now, when interest rates go up, the value of the bonds goes down. So the people that had lent, the banks that had lent this money said, hey, your assets are not as good as they were. Your collateral has dropped. You've got to cough up some more collateral. Well, at 40 times leverage, you don't have the money. So the whole MF Global crashed to the ground over super leverage. Now, this super leverage is what they've all been doing. All these financial shadow banks have been doing. I mean, it's quite the thing. So that gives you a window into what's been going on. And this repo business really, I can't go into it now, but that's the repo business is what caused was the mechanism that caused the crash in 2008. And that problem has not been solved even now. The Federal Reserve is trying to work it out, what they're going to do, but you know, they've tried to put more money behind the banks, but this repo business, which is part of the way the banking system works, has not been solved. So we're headed for another crash, there's no question.
John,
Yes.
the Federal Reserve just celebrated their 100th year anniversary. And although what you have spoken to tonight has given some important milestones, financial milestones, I'd like your response to the observation that the value of the dollar under the Federal Reserve's management is down now. I lose track, but I think it's somewhere around 2 cents of a 1913 dollar. Would you respond to that?
Well, yes. I've said here before that you really shouldn't have a private bank managing the money system of a country. I mean, you know, because really then it's part of this cozy money club. So if you're in the club, you get taken care of, right? As I said, an example, this long-term capital management system, that was a prime example of Greenspan and company stepping in and saving them. Now, with respect to inflation and so on, really that comes about through the Federal Reserve and the way you manage the money. Now, if you have proper real wages growing, okay, in proportion to the real growth in the GDP, I think you should be able to manage without too much inflation. So I think there are two things wrong. Is one, the Federal Reserve structure is wrong, and secondly, the macroeconomic management has been totally up the creek. I mean, basically, if you couldn't see these bubbles growing, and if you couldn't see the real danger, you must have been totally blind. I don't think they were totally blind. I think these things were managed because it's really shattered the American public. So that's why my title really is, you know, it's been a war on the American public, all the working public, really.
Do you think bondholders will head for the hills, and if they do, what will happen to the public?
Oh, the federal. Well, what is going to happen, of course, is that as interest rates go up, which they will, the value of the bonds will go down. So what has been happening is, of course, what we've seen. People are leaving bonds and going into stocks or anything. Because
when there's a mad
dash
for the hills.
Well, you know, what will happen is that this is another problem because people will start losing their asset value because they're stuck in bonds, okay? So again, there's likely to be bankruptcies and foreclosures and whatnot, really. It has to be. See, if you don't properly manage your macroeconomic affairs because and the financial system, this is what will happen.
How will they service the debt?
Service the debt? What you mean? No, the debt, the real debt is not. The government is not. The real debt is not the problem to the government, really. The real debt is the household debt and this private financial debt with the not the corporations but the banks. That's where the real debt is. Now the question, see, that's the real problem. If you look at where the real debt is in the country, it's not at the federal. The real debt I'm talking about, not the inflated debt. It's with households and the financial world, and that's what makes it so unstable. So that was my point. If you would have had proper wage growth, as we've spoken here before, if real wages had carried on marching upwards with the GDP, the median income, family income, would be $92,000 a year instead of the $60,000 it is now. So,
Where'd you get that from?
well, no, that's if you extrapolate, okay? Okay, Jim?
That still destroys savings, though.
Well, look, I'm not in favor of inflation, okay? What inflation means, you've not managed your economy properly. And, okay? Now, the Federal Reserve is part of this. But, Susie?
Okay, so that's a perfect segue into the question that I had, and I noticed, perhaps I wasn't paying close attention, but I noticed you didn't say much about individual homeowners or people with mortgages causing this problem. Okay, and it seems to me that so much of what the housing collapse has been blamed on individual people trying to buy loans or get into homes that were above their means, but we're not.
Well, okay, let me speak about that. There's a comedy skit in England by a duo called Bird and Fortune, and they said that okay, we're going to set up this wonderful fund, called the Super Highly Leveraged High Growth Fund. They said, well, what's good about that? Well, it's a wonderful name. And well, what are you going to do with this? Well, we're going to find some guy sitting in a string vest on his porch in a shack in Alabama, and we're going to sell him a mortgage, you see. Well, you know, isn't that bad? Well, look at the name of our fund. It's a high group. Anyway, no. Yes. So the asset bubble was really caused by Wall Street turning mortgages into an asset class that they could slice and dice and multiply. Now, when I bought my house in Dallas, I had to put down 20%. Okay. Well, of course, all that went by the board. I mean, if you were living and breathing, you could put an X, then you got a mortgage. Well, obviously, that was part and parcel of financial fraud, really, driven by the desire of Wall Street for financializing assets. In fact, I think they even financialized rock bands and things. So everything was a bubble, you know. Well, you know, but also brokers would find somebody who was breathing and say, "Oh, I'm sure you'd like a house," and it will, you know, "Are you breathing? Sign this, and don't worry, you know, you'll buy this house for $2 million, and within a year or so it'll be $3 million." So, you know, it's a no-brainer. So you know, so I mean, look, the whole thing was crooked. I mean, most of this whole financial bubble is crooked.
So I guess my question relates to, you know, it seems to me that so much of this was blamed upon the people taking out the mortgages as opposed to the individuals who were selling these products that, you know, to people who simply didn't qualify or probably needed to be a little bit more restrictive in their own.
Yeah, well, look, the real problem is that this whole financial system became criminal. Really, and this asset bubble that was delightful for them, but ruinous for the country, you know, was let loose really, and it was deregulated and blah blah blah. And as I said before, in London they had the Big Bang, and that they had no regulations whatsoever for anything. So as I say, one of the biggest culprits, Joe Cassano, operated legally from London until the whole thing crashed. No, the whole thing was fraudulent. You could, you know, anybody with a grain of sense who could see what was happening knew this was going to crash. It was quite obvious it would. So, you know, now, should people have not signed these mortgages? Should they? But they were told, look, there's no worries. I mean, you know, you buy this house, you sign the line, it's going to go up. You know, you're going to be richer next year than this year. So people thought, what have I got to lose? Because years ago in California, people had houses that several things happen. One, there'd be a flood and the houses would slide down the hill, or there'd be an earthquake and they'd vanish, or there'd be a fire. Normally they'd just walk away, actually. So that's a common thing to do in California. Well, in this case, they figured, what have I got to lose? I mean, there's an upside and I get rich, otherwise, on the downside, I walk away from it.
Could you assign a percentage of this whole financial
Mess?
Right, a percentage to individual homeowners versus corporate?
Well, look, in terms of the percentage of being some subprime mortgages, there are about, 20 million mortgages, of which there's only a few million that were subprime. But what happened was this credit default swaps, etc., were so lucrative that the Europeans and all the banks were chasing more and more of these lucrative things. So it was an incentive to find more of these people to create mortgages to borrow against. That was the prime incentive, because this was such a lucrative thing for the banks. Okay, so that's what drove this whole subprime mess. But as I said before, even in as early as the 90s, you could see, if you looked at the borrowing against this asset bubble, it could not go on. There was going to be an end to it, a very bad end. And what I've said tonight is that this is still happening. The problem has not been solved, and the Fed has just created yet another bubble. So, you just don't have. We don't seem to have anybody in government that's prepared to step in and fix it. It is fixable, but nobody has stepped in to do anything that I can see to fix it. I mean, of any party. I mean, really, they're all to blame.
I was wondering what you thought about the crises in Greece, Ukraine, and the ouster, or whatever you call it, in Iceland.
Oh, well, the Greek crisis really was caused by the completely flawed setup of the Eurozone. For example, there are some states in America that gain federal money, surplus, if you want, federal money from the government, okay? And they do this, and everybody says okay, because they're a part of the United States. So, okay, because some areas are poorer than others and so on. So no one says it. Now, in a union like this, Greece should have been treated the same way, but it was not set up like this, because you don't really have a central bank. You have a bank there, but it can't operate as a central bank. There should have been euro bonds and so on and so forth. Plus, there should have been a recognition on fiscal sharing. So it was misconceived. So when Greece went in, prior to the going in, it had the drachma. Well, their currency was overvalued. Okay, so they really, and when you have an overvalued currency, you really can't operate. Whereas Germany benefited, and their currency was undervalued. So basically, it was a flawed. It's a flawed setup, as it stands. And but they've got 50% unemployment with the young people in Greece, and in Spain too. So when you let mostly what I've been talking about today is really flawed political decisions by people who really should never have been allowed to make those decisions. And the activities of people like the Tea Party, who are completely ignorant of economics and finance, who think that, oh well, cut government spending and everything's going to be fine. No, that's not the problem. I mean, they're dangerous ignoramuses, basically. You know, I mean, look, this country is in bad economic shape. The people have been shortchanged and robbed, basically. And, you know, somehow or the other, they're going to have to face up to it. Somebody's going to have to tell them, but who will? They're hoping, the politicians, that magically this will all blow away and everything will go finally back to normal. It won't. It can't. I mean, you know, a family, you can imagine America as a big family. One day, well, the credit card is broken, has broken already. So...
You sort of stole some of my thunder a few minutes ago when you mentioned what the annual income would be if adjusted for inflation. What would be adjusted for inflation? What should the hourly wage be today had it been adjusted for inflation? And second question, what role did, say, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac play in the housing bubble? Were they holding sort of a gun at the back of loan officers trying to get everybody, the American dream homeowner, and were lending institutions selling those mortgages to other investors, the reason that it was so easy to get a loan? So there's basically three questions.
Okay. Yes. Well, firstly, where would the real wages be today is the question. Right. In real dollars, it really depends where you start the clock. If you go
minimum,
you want the minimum wage? Oh well, look, the minimum wage should be $12 an hour. It's no question. Minimum. I mean, I'm not talking about that minimum.
If it had kept up with inflation, it would be 12 minimum wage.
Well, if it kept up, yeah. If the wages in this country had kept up with productivity since '80, this country wouldn't be in the mess it's in, really. But coupled with that, you've had this, production zones being created overseas and jobs lost. And most of the jobs, actually, it turns out that all men have been lost more jobs than women, actually, in this downturn. So, in actual fact, the real wages now are lower than in 2000. The real wages. Now,
the other question was, what role did Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac?
Yeah, they were.
Some of them want to blame those two agencies for holding sort of a gun at the head of loan officers to try to get, say, more minorities into the American dream and homeowners, and were forcing them to do that.
Yeah. The real problem is that real wages have stayed flat. Okay. Now, so that basically speaking, the people just didn't have the money. They didn't have the money to afford to pay, because if you recall that the house prices, especially in California on the East Coast, rose at 15% a year. That was impossible on flat wages, which is what happened. So I mean, that was, yes, Fannie Mae and I think Jim knows about this, but Fannie Mae and Freddie were complicit as well. They were all in the game together.
Were they selling those loans to other investors, lending institutions?
Yeah.
So that's why it was easy to get them.
Oh yeah.
They had no vested interest in them.
Yeah, no, they did. No, well, it was the pressure from Wall Street, the demand. They wanted these loans because they wanted to slice and dice them and write credit default swaps against them. So that was the driving factor. It all came from Wall Street. So there was a demand for these loans, and anybody who was breathing would get loans, as you know. Now, yeah.
No.
I do know that, just from memory, that if wages had kept up with inflation only compared to 1968, 25% of the families would be making between 70 and 100 grand, and 12% between 100 and 160. That does not include productivity gains.
Hello.
Yeah, as I said, the median wage would be 92,000 a year actually. So basically, as I say, right now the real wages for the average wages are well below what they were in '73. So that's why they can't really. So it's that lack of wages. I mean, if you're out there, as I am, you can see it. People just don't have the money. They just don't have it. And really, the minorities and so on, and men have suffered the worst in this.
I was just concerned about where the minimum wage should be. So
yeah.
$18.
Well, it should be higher than it is because basically 70% of the economy is driven by consumer spending, and so as I said, what they've been doing to make it up, they've been borrowing. Well, they're maxed out, can't borrow anymore, and that's in mortgages. They got you lend to people who don't have the money, and you keep doing that, and that's it. That's what blew up, and then there's highly leveraged financial criminals. Hello.
So, I had so many questions, but everybody else did too. I'm going to have to just ask one, I guess.
One at a time.
Yeah, one at a time. What was the point of this talk, and what does it have to do with the title, conspiracy? I don't understand that.
No, I said basically there was no conspiracy.
Right, and
because
all you mentioned conspiracies, one after the other.
Well, because people believe that all these like the Rothschilds have captured all the banks and this is what's blah, blah, blah. No, all this was done by one series of bad political decisions after another. My point is, it wasn't a conspiracy.
Based on people stupider than you and me.
I think the majority were actually. The majority.
Okay, good, thank you.
In most countries are. I mean,
if the average family income was $100,000 a year instead of 60, what would they buy with it, and who would produce it?
Okay, well, they would. A couple of things have to happen, right? Firstly, what they buy with it should be made in America, okay, and grown in America. So just increasing wages, which immediately goes overseas, really doesn't help, okay? So that's the first problem. Even if they had more money, what would they do? Secondly, if they would have had more money, then they would not have been defaulting on the houses as much. Okay, if this crash hadn't happened and they lost their wages, then obviously you wouldn't have had all these foreclosures. Okay, now just parenthetically, do you know what the biggest resident of the new World Trade Center is going to be? Does anybody know? It's called China Trading. And they're there to help China buy real estate and American businesses. In fact, China is now buying in Detroit and buying huge office buildings. So, what I said a long time ago, like England, I mean, almost everything in England is foreign owned. Well, it's going to happen to America. So, yes, if they'd had more money, then Americans the poorest would have more money. They would be enjoying, if what happened was, as I said, the wages did not keep growth with the growth in productivity, which had happened up until 75. So if they would have had more money, then their standard of living would have gone up, okay? But there's a huge number of very, very poor people in this country who can't afford anything almost. So you have a growth in food banks and so on and so forth.
Most people in America think
that, well, if we can just transfer money from one pocket to another pocket, if the banks, if the Federal Reserve can bail out the banks, that'll solve the problem. If we tax the rich and give it to somebody else, that'll solve the problem. But the problem has to do with production.
Yeah, well, it has to.
And that's, if the average family made $100,000, we keep producing the same amount, then the price of everything's going to go up, and it's going to get to buy the same amount of stuff.
Yeah, actually, well, what drives wealth actually is productivity growth. But we've not, I mean, the investment has been overseas actually, in China and elsewhere.
Well, you know, the average American worker is much more productive than he has been, but we have many fewer workers than we used to have. The productivity of our country as a whole is not good.
Yeah, what has happened is that his productivity has gone up, but his wages have not been commensurate with that increase in productivity. That's what's happened.
Yeah, and we think if we pay people not to work, that will increase prosperity. But
well, of course
that's
not.
Not so.
No, of course not. So again, as I said, we need wages that keep up. To get back to this virtuous circle I talked about, one, you need real wages to keep up with productivity growth, which is not inflationary. Secondly, you need to reform the banks, and thirdly, you need to sort out this trade deficit problem, because you know, even as we speak, it's going up and up. So our cumulative trade deficit is 10 trillion. Well, you know, and as I said, we have a negative wealth of 4 trillion, which explains why you have this China trading center, the biggest occupant of the new World Trade Center that's going up. I mean, the writing is on the wall. You don't have to know advanced economics or anything to see what's going on. And you know, to me, it's unbelievable what's gone on. When I came here in '68, it was wonderful, great. They paid engineers like real engineers, you know, as I was. Well, it was wonderful. But we had a sneaking feeling then it couldn't last somehow. It was too good.
I really don't know much about this subject. It's very difficult for me to follow. I heard you say that we needed to have more jobs for more people to be working.
Yes.
I was born just after the New Deal, or I guess during the New Deal. I've always thought that the government stepped in and created jobs that saved a lot of people, including my family. How does that work? When the government creates jobs, who pays for the wages? And if you could give me a little more insight into that whole process.
Right. Well, since this government and other governments are sovereign, they can actually, and you have unemployment. Essentially, the government can create money. It's called high-powered money. So, but the mere act of them spending more than they're taking in creates more money. Now, that is how the money supply is increased, actually. I mean, I need a whole lecture, but the governments, they do it all the time. They create money in this fiat system, okay? They create money. As part of the talk I gave 2 years ago, I explained how the government should set up an investment bank and put in something like 800 million to fund new businesses. So they would fund the Small Business Administration, so young people or anybody who had an idea would be funded to start up a business. Now in countries like Italy, for example, instead of paying people to be unemployed, they get a group of 10 people together and they pay them unemployment money, but with training and whatnot to start up new businesses. Now, what I would do is actually create local development banks that are in business to create new businesses, thereby new jobs. Though rather than paying people to be unemployed, I'd rather get that money and pay people to start new businesses. I don't care what it is, window cleaning, manufacturing, this or that, doesn't matter. You get people into work so that every American, young American, gets basically guaranteed a job. Okay? So now, many of these businesses will go broke, but so what? I'd rather have them in work, going to work every day, learning how to work, learning new skills, rather than being at home unemployed with no hope. So that's what we have to do. Now, we have to bring back manufacturing to America. But if you change if you introduce the Keynes scheme, where you automatically balance trade, it would happen, because it would have to happen. So there's a whole series of things that I proposed to cure this problem. And personally, the first law I would pass is called the Crime Against Democracy. Basically speaking, what these politicians should always be told, anybody in office, we pay your salary. You work for us. The minute you cheat us, you're gone. And you're not only given a tap on the wrist, but you're gone for a long time. And if you are going to have the death penalty, I would say that these people who have cheated so much and caused so much damage would be the first to give the death penalty. And I really mean it. Because the harm they've caused, the millions of people, the marriages that have been destroyed, I mean, that's the gravest. But it's the trust we give to these people who sold the country out.
Do you think that if Glass-Steagall was remain in effect, that we wouldn't have had our mortgage boom? In other words, all this.
Yeah, a lot of it would not have happened. But when you uncoupled wages, real wages, from productivity growth, and you had this asset thing, yeah. But the asset bubble would not have been as large as if you'd have not enacted or destroyed Glass-Steagall. Yeah. So that was part of it. But there's a whole series of underlying problems that I've sort of skirted around. It's trade, it's financial deregulation, it's work, and so on. But I'll go back to it. I think the American people, there's been a war on the American people, really. And it's time they recognized it and got up and did something about it. Albert, you want to speak?
John gets to sit down now.
Now that you have time.
There we go.
Don't resell it.
Oh, I might make some money. No, I didn't.
Anyway, John did a terrific job. Now it's your time to talk. So who would like to rebut or talk either for or against what the speaker? You're first.
Thank you, Speaker of the House and Secretary. Guess if I'm for or against. Ha ha ha.
You're both.
I got some questions so I couldn't ask before. I don't want to be facetious about this conspiracy thing, but let's define the word conspiracy. What does that mean? In the early part of the talk, almost everything you mentioned sounded like a conspiracy to me. Let's see. Arbenz, Allende, I can't read my little writing here. Saddam Hussein got the nod, Corzine got let off, LIBOR, it went on and on. I'm not sure why you titled this talk that way. I mean, you brought out a lot of good information, we learned a lot. But basically, I think there is a conspiracy here. Maybe it has something to do with labeling people conspiracy theorists. last week, some of you were here, you missed the greatest conspiracy theorist of all. But I didn't have that much theory. We had a lot of theory here. We had a real academic deal here. Last week, yeah, he has copies here of an excellent talk. Excellent in this way. It's either really a bad lie and not a conspiracy theory, but a CIA agent trying to arrest us, or it was some heavy, direct witness information. Now, I'm kind of in between this. I'm come here mainly to push some of these things people like to call conspiracy theories, what I call is uncomfortable information that is essential to our role as in a democracy, of what we're supposed to do. And sometimes it's not pleasant. I mean, they might carry me away, and you guys will just go, well, you know. But yeah, that's what it's coming to, you know. Anyway, so as a conspiracy theorist, by many people's definition here, but not mine, I go out of my way not to present theories. I present much less theories than almost everybody here. I want to say I do not like that Project Camelot. I ran across that too. So don't think that I think like those people. I think in these troubled times, and with all these cheating and things going on, and there is a lot of secrecy and cheating, and that I think has something to do with conspiracy, especially with powerful people. If powerful people get together and there's secrecy, that's a bad combination, especially if they don't mind murdering and starting wars. I think, getting back to me and people and last week, the thing is it, logic. These Camelot people do not use logic at all. I mean, what I call logic is you present something, you have proof. Now, that's a tough one, but the rules of logic help us. Like we tend to want to believe things that we already believe. Like we'll listen to people who will applaud people who agree with us, even if it's ridiculously stupid. A few hundred years ago, I could be up here talking about the flat earth and everybody be applauding. So we can't go by majority rule. That's one problem with democracy too. Because if majority ruled, we would never have any advancement. So we have this strange balance between being cautious, which some people call conservative, and being stuck in the mud, which is some people call reactionary. So now I'm getting far afield. I had so many questions here, but the thing is, I think you'll correct me if I'm wrong if you get a chance. I think John says I figured out what's going on. Like so many people, we don't have to believe there's powerful people, you know, manipulating the strings. It's just force of economics, and I'm been trained in this, and it's fun for me to kind of figure out how these forces were going like this and that. And yet it's like missing things that are coming up every day. They're being exposed, one manipulation after the other. I mean, so I think we've been taken over. When I say that, here's what I mean by that. This might be my final thing here. I think we've been sold this idea that democracy is a good thing. This goes back to when the country started. We overthrew monarchs, then we overthrew monopolies, and we've been sold on this idea that that we have something to say, that we should be informed, that you know, and they've taken the media and given us lies lately, and it's increasing. On the other hand, we have the internet, which opposes it, but that's full of garbage too. So we got a problem. But we have to call them on that, because we've been taken over by people who do not believe in that. Like you listed a whole list of empire building things, and we don't have a democratic republic or anything. We have an empire. It's clear as a bell. But I say the big conspiracy is the media and the government in cahoots are still promoting that idea that we are a democratic republic and they give a damn about you and what you think. And We have to call them on that. I think that this is in humanity, like our allegiance. We're first human, I guess. Some people, next comes religion. I'm going to skip that one. Next comes your party or your country. Which comes first? Your country, then your party. I mean, there's like this hierarchy of things. And in our allegiance as human beings is kind of special in this country. This is where the light of freedom at least was ignited and made people's minds and hearts. In reality, there's a lot of corruption going on. But now that with technology, it's been accelerated to such a point. Is it almost 5 minutes? Oh, it is. I only did 3 minutes last week. I'm sorry. Anyway, let me wrap this up then. Even though we may never had a true democracy, this is such an idea that inflamed people's ideals all over the world. We have to fight for it. And I think John is sincere in his effort with that. And I am too, and I'm not a Camelot person. Thank you.
Okay, who's next? He's next. Right here. 5 minutes.
Well, I do thank John for his speech, and it is always informative and educational. However, I do disagree on a very fundamental basis. I do ascribe to a conspiratorial view of the economics in this country and what's going on here. And part of the reason I do is because of interviews I did back in 1996, 97 through 98 of a former agent of the U.S. government who worked under Bush when Bush was CIA, and then Bush while he was vice president, and then the last he was working for him was in 92. He was in over 100 meetings with Bush. And Bush spoke of many things about the destiny he and the upper echelon planned for this country. And there were some very confusing things back in 96 when I'm first hearing about some of these things. They were talking about bringing America down to second world status. Which amounted to basically destroying the American economy. And I mean, all this time I'm wondering, how do you take a basically a first world nation and bring it down to a second world nation status without going right through the bottom to third world? Well, I think we're in the process. All these different things, NAFTA, GATT, that was bipartisan. We had people from both parties. Glass-Steagall, that was bipartisan, But
it wasn't secret, right?
None of this is all going on out in the open, yet it may as well be secret because no one understands what's going on.
You read.
If I told you, okay, it's going to take me a little bit, but I'm going to rob you blind. And I'm giving you all the evidence, but you don't see it. Well, it's still. And as far as a conspiracy, if you want to say, is it going on in the open? I have over there a hour and 40-minute interview done with basically a military historian by the name of W. Craig Roberts. Basically on his book called The Medusa File, and it has to do with all these strange things that happen with government contracts and so forth from the assassination of JFK forward when LBJ took over, and how you had basically a consolidation of a corporate elite moving in and getting all the contracts. Special companies that got the nod and they got the no bid contract or they came in even though they might have not been the lowest bidder. The other guy got disqualified for some reason, and so yes, this has all been going on in plain sight. But who understands finances? I mean, we're all struggling. We're all trying to quantify this thing and make shape to it. I mean, right now, Christine Lagarde has been talking about a global currency reset. Do you have any idea what that means? But she's been speaking about it. She's been talking about it. She's been talking about baskets of currencies to support the SDR. Do you really know where we're going? We're not going anywhere which is profiting America. We're going to a global economy. America has had its economy destroyed. We are in economic collapse now. It's just, there was so much impetus and momentum. It's kind of hard for everything to kind of settle down to where you really understand what has been done here. And I'm sorry, that is a conspiracy. So, that's my word.
No conspiracy. Democracy is a device that ensures we will get exactly what we deserve. And that's exactly what we're getting. The reason that NAFTA got passed, Glass-Steagall got amended, we got in the WTO, is because of lobbying of congressmen who need campaign finances, money to finance their campaigns. That's the problem right then and there. Take the money out of politics, problem solved.
Very good. Who's next? It is. Five minutes.
Thank you. Not 3 minutes.
Remember, Susie is in here.
I know, but she's got her little beeper.
Yeah, we're ready.
I really could, as others, address a lot of issues. The main thing I'm going to address is I was astounded. Number one, I thought your presentation was very educated and very interesting, very informative. However, when you poo-pooed the idea of the control of the Rothschild banking system, I was just stunned. And I think that if someone has not read the book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, or watched Money Masters, they're in no position to comment on the subject, really. I see 4 rays of hope in this world today. Russia and Hungary have thrown the Rothschild banking systems out of their borders. Iceland is now prosecuting criminally their banking system, and they threw out their entire government. They had a massive march on their government. They threw them all out, held new elections, and elected a whole new government. And they did not accept all of this debt that is phony money debt, bubbles, of being put on them. It was the bankers' fault, and they're the ones to pay, and they're the ones they're going to get in prison. Now, in Ireland, they're having a huge public uprising against the banking system there too, and they're talking about criminal prosecution of the bankers. What I hope is that this is the precursor of a complete collapse of the Rothschild worldwide banking system that has been bankrupting nation after nation after nation on purpose. I forget his name now. I used to have his book. There was a dentist in Houston who was from Guyana, and he wrote a book. I can't remember the title of it. In any event, he talked about what happened in Guyana. They were a very happy country. They were a third world country, but anybody could just walk off the road and pick a pear or whatever out of the forest, and nobody lacked food. They were happy. They had a nice tourist trade. They had nice little businesses. Along came the World Bank and said to their leaders, of course, whom they can bribe to any amount, you need to be in the modern world with bridges, and you need power plants and all of this. Today, the interest on their national debt exceeds their gross national product. This is what the Rothschild banking system is by its very intention. Meyer Amschel Rothschild in the 1700s is quoted as having said, essentially, give me control of the currency of a nation and I care not who writes their laws. Because money controls government. And that's where we have to start right now and eliminate this private Federal Reserve System. Again, I'll say this for the 14th time. Thomas Jefferson, the time traveler from our time, back to the 1700s stated essentially, if we ever let a private bank get control of our currency, then through inflation and deflation and the corporate structure that will grow up around it, they will steal all the property from our descendants and leave them homeless in the land that we have founded. The Federal Reserve largely supports anything they want to because they're never audited. They can prepare and send any amount of money anywhere they want, either on a computer or on a pallet. And they do it all the time. Our money funded Al-Qaeda to invade Libya. That was a CIA operation. The Moriartys were there. They saw what went on. Our news media were bought totally by the Rothschild interest by the 30s, and that's why you can't get the truth out of American news media anymore. If you want to get the truth, go to other countries and look up things. Don't rely on our news media anymore. It's totally controlled. And we need to realize this. Yes, we have the best the government that money can buy, but money does almost everything in this world. If you cut off the money, a war ends. You fund the money, a war begins. And if you didn't come last week and hear the Moriartys, get a copy of their DVD and watch it. That is essential information. Oh, it's on YouTube also.
Okay, who's next? Come on up here.
I missed you last week.
We're running out of time, just so you know.
I promise not to talk about conspiracy. But I will tell you that in the Bible it says, by the sweat of your brow, you earn your bread. If we want to increase prosperity in the United States, we have to get people back to work. And there are two sources that the government could help with in terms of getting people back to work. One of them is we have a huge labor pool in the United States that's not working. And one of the reasons is that they are forced out of the labor pool by a huge migration of illegal immigrants. And it's easy enough to stop that. You know, Mitt Romney kind of got laughed out of the House, but he said E-Verify. If employers can't hire them, they can't work, and if they don't work, they won't come. The second is getting industry back in the United States. Now, you know, it goes counter to what a lot of people think, but the fact is that you have to incentivize people to invest in the United States. And the way you do that is you offer tax credits to companies that build factories in the United States. Now, that's not taxing the rich, but I will tell you that our president talks about taxing the rich, but when he started, he had a majority in the House, a 2/3 majority in the Senate, him in the White House. If he wanted to tax the rich, he would have taxed the rich. That's not going to happen because both parties are bought by moneyed interests, whether they're bankers or corporations or whatever, or labor unions for that matter. And, you know, we're going to have to get America back to work. But the other problem is that the moral decay of our country. We no longer have the old Protestant work ethic of hard work, strong families, and ethics in our lives, and that's reflected in the people that work in government. It's reflected all over our country. You know, there are plenty of people that are making their living by scamming things, by lying about how much their income is to buy a house, by inflating the appraisal of the house so they can get a bigger mortgage. And plenty of people on the banking side that say, well, sure, I know you're lying about all that, but we'll loan you the money because we get a fee for that. And, you know, somewhere along the line, we have to rebuild the standards of America. We have to have strong families. We have to have some morality in our nation. And I will leave you with something to think about. There's only one party, or a faction of a party in the United States who's pushing for that. The Republicans are not pushing to reform the government. They are the government and they like it. The Democrats don't intend to reform the government. They are the government and they like it. The only people who are working hard to try to make the government more ethical, to limit it, to promote strong families and moral lives, are those ignoramuses in the Tea Party.
Oh, we're running out of time. All right, let me just, if we don't, I'll be the last man standing. So I want to thank our speaker. I think he did a terrific job tonight. Just a comment. I think that well, as he brought up, and as you brought up just now, that we got 25 million people out of work in this country, and our corporations have gone overseas to go where labor costs are cheaper. We really need to put tariffs on corporations. That has to happen in order to balance out the labor costs of other countries so that they will produce here and there. Then we'll have jobs here that we don't have now, and this will improve things. He brought up during his speech about the fact that wages have remained flat, I guess, for over 30 years. And the reason they remain flat is because we've had a surplus of labor all this time, and you can't compete. That's part of it. And so we've got 25 million people out of work. I was in the railroad industry. We lost the cabooses, put everybody in the engine. We got down, they got one person doing the work. They can't do the work. So they end up with train loads instead of car loads. They get rid of everybody. You got 5 people on pension now for everyone that's working. It used to be 5 people working for everyone that's on pension. That's how bad it is. So we've got to reduce the work day. We've got to put people to work, but we can't do that until we go overseas and we try to put in tariffs against corporations. In my view, if we put against countries, we've got a price war. If we put against corporations, Apple's producing everything in China and selling it here, they can pay the difference of labor costs. Then they'll end up producing here besides there. And these other companies, they're all making. Why are these corporations making the money they're making? Because they're using cheap labor somewhere else. That's the basic economic fact. So I better shut up while I'm ahead, and we'll bring our speaker up here.
We're going to applaud you for shutting up.
Yes, you are.
Thank you, John.
Well, it was nice to come and air some thoughts tonight. Yes, I think if you have a democracy, then it's the responsibility of the electorate to actually read and know what's going on. And when bad things happen because the politicians start stealing from them, basically they've only got themselves to blame, as I think Jim said. So with the right to vote comes responsibility to know what's going on. And there are outfits like the League of Women Voters that try to educate the public. Clearly, much more needs to go on in that direction. Yes, my take was that really all these things that have happened, what the CIA have done, in fact, in a sense, we in Europe knew more about what the CIA was doing. It was quite well publicized about the assassination of Arbenz and so on than the American public. So these things were known. Most of these things that I've talked about were well known. And all the political decisions were well known. Now, you only have to step back and say, you say, well, what is going on? It is evident what's going on. And these decisions, many of them were made by the Democratic Party. Others were made by the Republican Party. But they were made, and they were made in the open. That's why I said, look, if it's all made in the open, it's not a conspiracy. Now, behind the scenes, people pushed for these things to be brought in. But, look, they were passed by the Congress. They were signed by the President. They were not secret. That what the CIA was doing, really. I mean, we knew what they were probably up to. But eventually, but at the time, in the 50s, I used to read the New Statesman, and it was quite clear what was going on. So that's why I say, look, if it's open and everybody, it's well known, it's not really a conspiracy. Now, yeah, there may well be the Rothschilds behind all the banks, but what the banks are doing is known. Well, what new financial instruments they're inventing is well known. It's not a secret. Now, I mean, if you don't care about such things, then the bank has gone their merry way, stealing from everybody. I mean, look, one example, for example, I think I've talked about this before. In London, the fire brigade was privatized. Okay. So why would you privatize the fire brigade? Well, think about it. So what have the fire brigade, what have they got that's valuable in London? The answer quickly comes to mind, buildings. And guess what? Just in this last couple of weeks, they've sold off 12 fire brigade headquarters. And guess where they sold them off? No. They sold them off all around central London, where the values of the properties are enormous. So that's why it was privatized. So, you know, you don't have to be a genius you just think, why was this done? Ask the question, why? And immediately, you know, as the man said in Watergate, follow the money. It's all about money. It's all about greed. But really, as Jim said, it's really that the politicians have been bribed by the rich interests. So that's why I'm saying you haven't got democracy. That's why the people of this country have been robbed, blind. And everyone's been robbed. I mean, all this needless, ridiculous wars, come on. And the point about talking about the CIA, because America needs export markets. Now, if the CIA is going around wrecking, you know, America's image in these markets, what do you think you've done to your export markets? You've not protected anything. You've not protected the thing you should protect. You've protected the crooked, cartel operations, but that's about it. But where's it got you? Look, I mean, financially, you've ruined the country. So, you know, so that's my point, really. It's not a conspiracy, I think. It's all been happening in the open air. You just have to think, you know, why is this done? What is this, Lord? I mean, like the Trans-Pacific Partnership. You don't have to, secret, but you don't have to, I can tell you what's in it. It's obvious what's in it. No, you can, right, I can tell you right away. The corporations can set up, with the rule of law in these countries, they can have, if something goes on that they think is restraint of trade in that country, they can sue that country. You'll have free flow of capital in and out, hot money in and out of that country for the banks and so on. That's what's in it. It's quite evident what's going to be in it. So now, does that help America? Does that help the American people? Of course not. Helps the banks, helps the big cartel corporations, but it's just more of the same. And I don't see Obama doing anything to stop it. So, you know, thank you.
Okay, they kick us out of here at 9 o'clock, so we have to leave. And I want to thank our speaker and everyone here. And we're gonna retire to Starbucks down the street. You're all welcome. Our speaker is welcome. We'll buy him coffee and talk to him, and you'll get one-on-one with him if you like. And that's it. So hope all is well.
This is William, your videographer from Two Hats Publishing. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you like it, please leave comments below, or like us, or follow us, and get notices of all our videos. We love it, even when you call. So when visiting the Barbeck's restaurant, tell them you want your reservation to the next College of Complex class.